One of the biggest hurdles we face when we start off with photography is just the sheer number of concepts that we seem to need to master just to take a decent photo. And usually a lot of times I think it can make it so that people get put off by trying out different things in photography, and then the camera just becomes a dust collector on the shelf, a very expensive one at that. So in this video, I want to go over why learning to learn photography matters and 5 tips that have helped me learn as effectively as possible so that I'm not wasting as much time in the field. So when I started off in photography not too long ago, I did stumble a lot, and it seeped into my photography when I was out into the field. I would return and come back with blurry photos, overexposed or underexposed photos, and not be able to edit any of them just because I messed up a lot of the technical stuff when I went out. If I had only learned more effectively, I would have been able to go out and not miss those shots when the conditions were great. So over this past year, I realized that there have been things that worked really well and helped me understand and cement more obscure concepts in photography. The goal is not just to understand the theory, right? When we read an article online about some photography concept, we don't want to just understand it by reading it. We want to be able to translate it and make it into muscle memory. And this means that what we want to do is then be able to go out when we are taking photos and not have to think about the camera as much, not have to think about all the things that we learned, but be able to seamlessly and effectively apply those concepts to our camera, to our photography, and not miss the shot just because we were spending too much time trying to recall what we had learned. Tip number 1, fostering a love of curiosity. Because we have already decided to go into photography, that already indicates some level of curiosity within the field. Being eager and able to try things that are new to us, that are uncomfortable, leads to some amazing things. A lot of the creators who create art or ideas or just, scientific discoveries, for example, get there because they have tried different things that they have never tried before. They've tried things that other people haven't tried before. So for us as photographers, this doesn't necessarily have to be limited to just different camera settings, but should be embedded in every part of the photography stage. So for example, just being curious about what a subject looks like from a different point of view, or just trying out something that you've never tried before. It's curiosity that will keep you excited and growing in your photography journey. Tip number 2 is to embrace your shortcomings. And what I mean by this is that you want to be able to tell yourself when you don't know something, and you want to be able to tell others when you don't know something. Just this idea of knowing that you will never know everything and there will always be someone to teach you something new will get you to be a lot more humble and be open to different ideas that other people have had. So sometimes when we think we know something but we really don't, we are unable to answer other questions about it. We're unable to actually effectively use it in the field just because we don't really have that idea or concept in mind. And the idea is to not be upset by the things that you don't know, but to actually be eager about it. The fact that there are things out there that you still don't know, and that learning those things will definitely make you better in your photography. Tip number 3 is learning to critique your own photos. And this doesn't mean just looking at your photos and saying that they're not good enough. Actually going into the photo and then looking at the different aspects of the composition, the lighting, the editing, and thinking to yourself, okay, when I took this photo, what was happening around me? Was there a lot of wind? Was I using a tripod or was it handheld? What settings did I have? And how did that affect the different things? So if, for example, it's blurry, was it on a tripod and the wind was blowing and I was using the zoom lens, right? So a lot of these factors combined together to produce a more blurry image, and then in relation to the settings that I was using, maybe it wasn't enough to compensate for that. And then from there, you come up with some questions to ask the internet, basically, or other books, because then you know what you need to do to improve that photo. And this will then naturally lead you to asking more and more questions because you will encounter different ideas and different concepts. So you're basically growing your knowledge like a tree. From each question comes 2 other questions, and so on and so forth. Tip number 4 is to use your camera. And this may seem simplistic and abstract, but believe me, it was the biggest thing that changed my photography and how quickly I learned photography. When you learn something, you don't want the first time you actually apply that thing to be out in the field. You want to be able to take your camera right where you are when you learn it, for example, sitting at your desk, and try out that concept for the first time over there. There's definitely going to be things around your house that you can just point and shoot at. So for example, when you learn about the exposure triangle, you learn about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. But to fully understand how those different things affect exposure, what you want to do is mentally draw a grid and put ISO, shutter speed, and aperture values in that grid, keeping one thing moving while the other thing are constant. So for example, my ISO is set to 100 and my shutter speed is set to 1/200th of a second. What happens if I change my aperture? How does it affect the light? How does it affect the focus, the sharpness, etc.? And similarly for other concepts, right? So what does it mean for us to not be able to get details out of shadows or bright light, right? So if you point your camera straight at the sun, when do you start to see clipping happen? And what is clipping, right? Similarly, a question that I had early on is, how does aperture affect depth of field? And what does that even mean for focus? Tip number 5 is to explore with abandon. And what this means is, when we start off in photography, we will naturally have a lot of questions that pop up. But a lot of times we might not even have an idea of how to translate the questions that we have in our heads and the problem that we see into actual questions that we can ask on Google, for example. So the idea is to create different channels of consumption about thoughts and ideas in photography. This can be just subscribing to a newsletter or a YouTube channel of a photographer that you are inspired by, or it can just mean listening to more podcasts about photography. When I started photography, I went to the library and checked out a bunch of different books pretty much talking about the same thing, but with their own styles. So with each book, it added an extra layer on top of the concept in my head, and I was able to connect different pieces together just because of the different contexts presented within the book. So when I venture out into the field and I encounter other photographers, I'm very open to talking to them because a lot of the time they teach me new concepts that I've never even thought about. So for example, this long exposure of streams with bubbles creates a kind of whirlpool effect. A technique I had seen before but never really thought about until that day when a photographer pointed it out to me. The idea behind exploring anything and everything is that you will encounter different thoughts and ideas that will draw out the questions you had at the very beginning, the questions that you didn't know how to ask. And so what you'll realize is that the concept answers your question perfectly. It fits like a puzzle. And so to be able to have those eureka moments, you want to be able to explore as much as possible. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.